Most people believe they understand danger when it appears. They look for aggression, control, or chaos. But what truly harms you doesn't usually come in those forms. It wears a face you recognize. It speaks in tones that don't raise alarm. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the terrain of the unconscious. He knew that what remains unseen within a person eventually spills into others. Not out of intention, but out of ignorance. Someone's unresolved fears, unspoken shame, or unmet needs don't stay quiet forever. They find a way to live, often in the people closest to them. You may think you're being compassionate or helpful, yet you might be absorbing emotions, responsibilities, and roles that never belonged to you. This isn't always easy to identify. The individuals who drain your mind often believe they're doing nothing wrong, and maybe they aren't, at least not consciously. But the result is the same. You feel smaller, you second-guess yourself, you lose touch with what you once trusted. In this analysis, you will meet 6 psychological types Jung would consider hazardous to your inner stability. Each one reflects a failure to confront the self, and in doing so pulls others into that failure. What you learn here is not meant to create fear. It's meant to create distance, a space between what's yours to carry and what was never meant for you. 1. The mirror with no reflection. They never argue. They smile when you speak, agree when you question, and support whatever decision you make. At first, you think you've found someone peaceful, but slowly, unease replaces comfort. You begin to realize they're not calm. They're hollow. Carl Jung described the danger of people who confuse persona with identity. The persona, the mask we wear to navigate society, is meant to serve a function, not become the self. When someone loses that distinction, they become a mirror. They reflect everyone else while remaining invisible to themselves. The person with no inner center doesn't disagree because disagreement would require a standpoint, and having a standpoint risks rejection. So instead, they vanish into passivity. They're pleasant to be around until the relationship demands something real: discomfort, truth, emotional presence. And that's when the cracks form. They're not trying to deceive you. In fact, they believe they're being good. Avoiding conflict, accommodating your preferences, staying agreeable. But beneath this agreeable surface is a refusal to engage with their own emotions. They avoid responsibility for their inner life by outsourcing meaning to those around them. And you, unknowingly, become the anchor they never built for themselves. This is where the danger lies. You start carrying both people's weight. You provide direction, depth, and structure, while they quietly disappear into the background of your life. And slowly, without realizing, you begin to feel alone in the relationship. You may even blame yourself. You ask if you're too needy, too intense, too sensitive. But the truth is simpler. They have never learned to exist outside of how others see them. The more you try to connect, the more elusive they become. They nod, they listen, they seem supportive, but there's no real person behind the gestures. No friction, no core. This isn't peace, it's absence. Jung warned that people who lose themselves in the persona become emotionally dangerous, not because they attack, but because they absorb. They don't harm through action, they harm through erasure. They blur your sense of connection by offering only an echo of your own voice. What makes it harder is that they appear so harmless. But that's what makes this dynamic so quietly corrosive. You're never confronted, but you're never truly met either. Eventually, the illusion breaks. You realize you're in a relationship with someone who isn't truly present, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to be anyone real. To protect yourself, you must recognize this lack of selfhood as a warning, not a flaw to fix. It is not your job to help someone construct their identity. Your presence should never be a substitute for theirs. Jung taught that individuation, the journey toward becoming whole, requires the courage to face what's inside, not escape it through performance. Without that journey, a person becomes a vessel for others' needs, a mask that eventually cracks under the weight of emotional reality. You deserve more than a reflection. You deserve someone who can stand beside you as themselves, not someone who disappears every time you look closer. 2. The silent judge. They don't raise their voice. They don't confront. They sit in silence, and somehow you still feel accused. Their disapproval doesn't come through insults or critiques. It seeps into you through careful pauses, a glance too long, a sigh too short. Carl Jung spoke often of the dangers of repression masked as righteousness. The silent judge lives in this territory. They rarely express anger or discomfort directly. Instead, they signal it in ways that force you to guess, analyze, and overcorrect. They offer no resolution, just the feeling that you've done something wrong. Their authority lies in ambiguity. Because they never explicitly shame you, it becomes difficult to call their behavior what it is: judgment. You begin to censor yourself, not because of hostility, but because of the invisible pressure of expectation. This person believes they are upholding standards, but the truth is simpler. They are avoiding their own emotional contradictions. Jung believed that those who repress their shadow, the darker, unconscious parts of the psyche, often project moral ideals outward. They create rules for others they secretly can't follow themselves. And so, the silent judge watches others closely, not to help, but to avoid the work of looking inward. They may never tell you that you're wrong, but over time you start believing it. You feel guilt when you express joy. You hesitate before making decisions. You shrink not because you're afraid of conflict, but because you're afraid of disappointing their unspoken standards. Living under this quiet scrutiny distorts your sense of self. You internalize their gaze. You begin measuring your worth by how comfortable they are with your choices. And in the process, you slowly abandon parts of yourself that once felt natural. Jung warned that morality, when used to control others, becomes a form of psychic domination. It doesn't liberate, it binds. The silent judge is not violent, but their presence erodes your freedom, one unspoken expectation at a time. The only way to escape this trap is to stop negotiating your truth with someone who refuses to share theirs. 3. The collector of debts. They never forget a favor, not out of gratitude, but out of calculation. You might not notice at first. They're helpful, generous, seemingly dependable. They offer their time when you're overwhelmed. They listen when you need support. And for a while, it feels genuine. But slowly, their help starts to shift. There's a subtle price. It comes in the form of expectations. You were helped, now it's your turn to give back. Not because you want to, but because they've been silently keeping score. Carl Jung warned that unconscious expectations, when unmet, often manifest as resentment. The collector of debts is fueled by unspoken assumptions. They give, not to support, but to bind. Their kindness is never unconditional. It is a psychological transaction with emotional leverage attached. They may not demand anything directly. That would be too honest. Instead, they withdraw when you don't reciprocate in the way they imagined. They become cold, distant, occasionally passive-aggressive. You begin to feel like you're always on trial. One misstep, one boundary, one act of independence, and the debt is suddenly due. But it's not a real debt. You never agreed to this dynamic. You never signed the contract. And yet, here you are, being held accountable for a script you didn't write. What makes this more destructive is the guilt it produces. You question your integrity. You wonder if you've been ungrateful. The collector knows this. They rely on your conscience. They weaponize your decency. They may even play the victim. I've done so much for you. I guess I just care more than you do. These aren't statements, they're traps. Jung believed that when love is used to control, it's no longer love. It's dependency in disguise. The collector of debts doesn't want a partner. They want proof. Proof that they matter. Proof that they're valuable. And they demand it through your guilt. But here's the truth. Real connection isn't a ledger. It's a mutual, unforced rhythm. It thrives on presence, not pressure. You are not cruel for choosing your boundaries. You are not selfish for walking away from a relationship built on obligation. You are simply refusing to participate in an emotional economy where every act of care is recorded for future use. The danger of this person lies in the way they invert emotional responsibility. You begin to feel like the unreliable one. But the truth is, they never gave to give. They gave to be owed. And the more you try to repay, the more they raise the cost. Jung urged us to ask where our motivations end and where others' projections begin. In this case, what you owe is clarity. To yourself, to the relationship, and most of all, to your peace. 4. The wounded performer. They share everything, but not in a way that opens the door to connection. They flood you with personal stories, grief, betrayal, injustice, abuse, until you forget you were a person with your own needs too. At first, it sounds like vulnerability, but it's not. It's strategy, often unconscious but deeply rehearsed. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, what we deny in ourselves and refuse to process. The wounded performer externalizes their shadow through narrative. Their trauma becomes an identity. Their suffering becomes performance. They're not seeking healing. They're seeking significance. This isn't to say their pain isn't real. It often is. But it's been frozen, weaponized, used as emotional currency. If you question the story, you're heartless. If you suggest growth, you're insensitive. If you withdraw, you're abandoning them all over again. This is where the dynamic becomes toxic. You are expected to be both audience and savior, listening endlessly, reassuring constantly, sacrificing repeatedly. Your own pain becomes invalid unless it fits the script. Your joy is seen as disloyalty to their grief, and so you shrink. Jung taught that suffering, when integrated, becomes strength. But when clung to, it mutates into power over others. The wounded performer remains stuck, not because healing is impossible, but because they've built an identity that depends on never moving forward. To be clear, we all carry wounds. But there is a difference between someone willing to examine their pain and someone addicted to the attention it brings. They speak often, but never reflect. They ask for support, but never grow. They demand emotional labor, then accuse you of neglect when you finally need rest. In time, you begin to resent their stories. Not because the stories are wrong, but because you're not allowed to stop hearing them. That resentment then becomes your burden too. This is the cost of being close to someone who thrives on emotional imbalance. You are always in debt. You are always responsible. You are never enough. Jung's solution was simple, but not easy. Withdraw the role. Step out of the script. Let their pain be theirs, not yours to carry, not yours to fix, not yours to orbit. Compassion does not mean self-erasure. You are allowed to care without being consumed. You are allowed to listen without being defined. You are allowed to leave when the performance becomes a prison. 5. The charming black hole. They shine brightly at first. They seem alive, attentive, magnetic. They remember details. They laugh easily. They touch your shoulder when they speak. You feel like you've known them forever. But what you're feeling isn't familiarity. It's gravitational pull. Carl Jung warned about those who never cultivated a self. Because when the inner structure is weak, a person becomes hungry. Not for food, not even for love, but for psychic nourishment. They feed on the vitality of others to maintain their illusion of wholeness. The charming black hole doesn't need control. They need presence. constant presence. They require your time, your responsiveness, your availability. Not because they're cruel, but because without your reflection they disappear. At first you feel seen, but over time you begin to feel used. The connection, once electric, becomes draining. You find yourself responding to messages out of guilt, not desire. You cancel plans to reassure them. You adjust your tone so they won't spiral. This is the beginning of psychic fatigue. They rarely demand outright. Instead, they imply. They talk about being too much or hard to love, fishing for reassurance. And you give it again and again because you've been pulled into the emotional gravity of someone who confuses intensity with intimacy. Jung believed that when a person fails to individuate, fails to build an internal world, they rely on fusion. Fusion is not love. It is collapse. It is the blurring of boundaries in a desperate attempt to feel real. These people don't just want you close. They want to live inside you, to think with your mind, feel with your heart, define themselves by your reactions, and when you withdraw, even slightly, they feel it as death. This is why they panic when you rest, when you grow, when you stop needing them. Because without your reflection, they feel erased. You try to help, you try to soothe, but the hunger never ends. They don't want your presence for connection. They need it for survival. This is the essence of psychic vampirism. It is not cruel by design, but it is dangerous in impact. Jung warned us that unresolved dependency creates emotional cannibalism. It's not violent, it's gradual, and eventually you don't recognize yourself anymore. You feel guilty for needing space. You feel selfish for reclaiming your thoughts. You feel distant from the person you were before this started. That is not love. It's erosion. To break free, you must be willing to be misunderstood. You must accept that no amount of reassurance can fill someone else's void. You are not their home. You are not their healer. You are not the sun they orbit. You are your own sovereign mind, and no one, no matter how charming, has the right to drain that into darkness. 6. The puppet master of chaos. They never shout. They don't throw things or curse or demand, yet everything around them feels unstable. You lose friends when they enter your life. You find yourself caught in misunderstandings that never existed before. You explain yourself more often than you should, and still, somehow, they're always the one caught in the middle. Carl Jung taught that when the unconscious is not confronted, it seeks expression through projection. The puppet master of chaos lives in this exact process. They don't think they cause problems. In fact, they often present themselves as the peacemaker, the victim, or the neutral party. But beneath that neutrality is a psychological strategy, often invisible even to them. They provoke with softness. They just share a concern. They pass on what someone else said. They plant a seed of doubt, then step back to watch it grow. You're not dealing with direct conflict. You're dealing with covert chaos. It's disorienting, because nothing is ever clear enough to confront. No statement is ever sharp enough to challenge. You're always left wondering if maybe it's just you. And that's the power they hold, not dominance, but distortion. Jung believed that some people project their unconscious wounds into the external world so completely they rearrange reality itself. They can't tolerate their own confusion, so they spread it. And when others begin to unravel, they feel validated, safe, because now they're no longer the only one who's lost. You begin to walk lightly. You choose words with care. You delay hard truths. Not because they asked you to, but because chaos has consequences, and you've learned that too much honesty means something will break. And they won't take responsibility for the break. They'll say, "I just wanted to help. I thought you deserved to know. I didn't mean anything by it." But they did. They meant to stir, to confuse, to destabilize. Not consciously, but inevitably, Because this is how they survive, by pulling others into a psychic weather system they can't control. You can't fix this. You can't restore order. The only escape is clarity. Jung emphasized the need for psychic hygiene, the refusal to be dragged into someone else's unconscious chaos. You don't need to explain. You don't need to accuse. You simply need to detach. Let them rearrange someone else's reality. Yours is no longer available. Eventually, it's not the obvious threats that undo you. It's the ones that wear familiarity like a disguise. A soft tone that unsettles, a closeness that consumes, a dynamic that feels off but lacks explanation. Carl Jung warned us that the unconscious seeks expression, always. If not through dreams or reflection, then through projection. And what is projected doesn't vanish. It lands on someone. Often that someone is you. You might think you're helping by staying. That patience will fix the confusion. But some wounds belong to others, and no amount of understanding can make them yours to heal. There's nothing cruel about choosing your own clarity. There's no guilt in stepping away from a cycle you didn't create. Freedom, as Jung saw it, is born not from isolation, but from integrity. When you no longer betray yourself to maintain peace with those still at war with themselves, you begin to live differently. You start to see. And once that happens, there's no going back.